COVID-19 world. We have three panelists: Luisa Biervis, who is from the University of Amsterdam and the Institute for Human Sciences. She is the professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam. She is a political geographer and professor of European governance in the Department of European Studies. She has been a visiting professor at the College of Europe, Natolin, since 2013. Her particular attention has been on the geopolitics of EU's migration management at the Union's external borders and beyond. And her most recent work investigates how broader geopolitical concerns touch down in domestic politics with a focus on far-right movements and nativist movements and parties. We have then Professor Alessandro Monsuti. We were fortunate to have him in Calcutta once earlier, and we are looking forward to his next visit, as we are looking forward to hosting Luisa also, in hopefully very soon in the post-corona time. Alessandro is the professor of anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. He has been a research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies and Yale University. He was a grantee of the MacArthur Foundation and a visiting professor at the University of Vienna and Arizona State University. He is also research associate at the Refugee Studies Center, University of Oxford. He has worked as a consultant for several international and non-governmental organizations such as the UNHCR. Alessandro specializes on the refugee flow from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. He studies modes of solidarity and cooperation mobilized in a situation of conflict and forced migration. But he has now broadened the geographical scope of his research to include the members of the Afghan diaspora living in Western countries. He has interest and wrote on the theoretical and methodological issues related to globalization. Among his current research interests, the political economy of reconstruction of Afghanistan as an example of the emerging forms of sovereignty and global governance, asylum seeking, refugees in Europe, and the changing nature of borderlands in Europe and South Asia. And our final panelist is Professor Thomas Alexander Alenikov, University Professor of the New School, New York. He is serving as the director of the Zolberg Institute of Migration and Mobility since January 2017. He is from Yale Law School, and before that, Southampton College. He has written widely in the areas of immigration and refugee law and policy, transnational law, citizenship, race, and constitutional law. He's currently working on a book, but I think this has come out, The Arc of Protection, Reforming the International Refugee Regime. And may I say that I have personally benefited enormously from this book. He is a co-author of the leading legal case books on immigration law and forced migration. Before coming to New School, he served as the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees from 2010 to 2015 and was a professor at Georgetown University Law Center. He was co-chair of the Immigration Task Force for President Barack Obama's transition team in 2008. From 1994 to 97, he served as the General Counsel and then the Executive Associate Commissioner for Programs at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So friends and colleagues, you can see that we have been able from Calcutta, courtesy the lockdown, courtesy Corona, and courtesy the new Zoom technology, etc. We have now the three panelists from whom we have so much to learn and so much to listen to. And may I now request Professor Luisa to speak first. Generally, I would suggest that let us not take more than 10 to 12 minutes in the first round, and then there will be questions from the audience, the listeners, and I shall request all of you to go back, revisit, and speak further on whatever you would be leaving out due to the constraints of time. Even though we have 1 hour, 15 minutes for this session, but I begged the organizers that you have to give me 10, 15 minutes more. And Kushumik and others, the stern colleagues I have, they kindly agreed. So, Louisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ranavir, and thank you for this very kind introduction and for the invitation to be part of this closing panel. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing my colleagues and also the questions, because I'm also very curious to hear what colleagues will have to say. So I wanted to focus my comments, and I'll try to be actually probably briefer than 10 minutes, on the geographical imaginations of the pandemic, and especially of the geographical imaginations of borders as related to the pandemic. I guess one of the most striking things to me as a political geographer was this pressing anxiety right from the very start to make sense of COVID geographically, to locate it, to map its pathways, not just in the body, but across the globe. For somehow fixing it in space was the first step to somehow attempting to govern it. But in this rush to map the pandemic, this cartographic vertigo that gripped both political pundits and virologists, the sort of geographical imaginations, the sort of geographical representations and the associated policy solutions that were and continue to be adopted were surprisingly of a very old-fashioned sort. So here we were faced with a virus that was making a mockery of borders, and yet the principal defense against it was border closures, was containment, the interruption of flows, or at least of certain flows. Openness was recoded as danger. And I remember distinctly following the first media accounts of what was happening in northern Italy, which was the site first, in a sense, hit in Europe. And the account of why the virus was making its appearance in certain small towns in Lombardy was explained by the fact that these were hyper-connected trade and production nodes, and so hyper-exposed to global flows, in this case also viral. Now, in no way do I want to question the utility of containment, the utility of closures, lockdown policies in managing the spread of the pandemic. What I want to draw our attention to, and I guess think with you through, is how these pandemic fantasies of the protection offered by the enclosure of space laid bare in many ways all the existing contradictions and inequalities of the modern border imagination. So I don't need to say this to all of you as border scholars, as migration scholars, but the imagining of borders has always been a fantastic enterprise. So imagining a confine that was somehow able to delimit and protect our outside from a hostile, from our inside, sorry, from a hostile outside. And in our pandemic moment, this immunological imagination of borders, to borrow Roberto Esposito's term, was taken, of course, to its most extreme forms, but also precisely exposed all of its fundamental contradictions of who and where was being bordered and who and where was worthy of protection, who and where was worthy of care. And what the pandemic crisis laid bare, indeed, was very much a sorting of the right to care, a sorting of the right to protection. Once more, as scholars of migration, and there are people here with us today who have written about this extensively, we're very well familiar with this mechanism of selectivity that is operated by borders and by border agents. So sorting the deserving from the undeserving, but also deliberating on who is most vulnerable, who is the most desperate, who's the most at risk. So the forms of containment that have been and continue to be implemented to contain the pandemic have been equally selective. So measuring out protection, measuring out care, but in very unequal measure. And this has been true both at the level of states, of multi-state regional wholes such as the European Union, but also of cities and localities. So I wanted to bring just a few kind of anecdotal examples, and I'm sure all of you can think of other ones, just to get us to think about this, because I think they highlight the selective sorting, but also, very importantly, visibilization of who is to be protected, who is to be cared for. So as infections began skyrocketing in Amsterdam in late summer, the Dutch health minister publicly singled out specific neighborhoods in the west of the city and the Turkish and Moroccan communities as the main culprits of the spread, commenting on the nightly news and subsequently in interviews how large religious and family gatherings were to blame and not the overflowing cafes and hordes of tourists in the city center. His comments were subsequently taken up by the Prime Minister, by Prime Minister Rutte, suggesting that it was actually a problem for the government in reaching these communities that, quote, did not understand the rules. Now, the fact that a predominance of public transport staff, cleaners, and other workers in sectors that were the most exposed to the pandemic and that certainly didn't have the choice of working from home, this question, I mean, did not at all come up. So locating the problem within these neighborhoods, within these populations, indeed directly scapegoating them as the vectors of the spread, allowed the remainder of the city's economy to keep chugging along as though the pandemic didn't exist. But as the crisis worsened, and it did, and hospital beds began to quickly fill up, the kind of pedagogic tone, this instructional tone of the center-right government, kind of emphasizing the need to instruct these unenlightened and insufficiently sanitized migrant populations, gave way to much more extreme expressions, with far-right politician Geert Wilders, who some of you will unfortunately know, tweeting that he found it unacceptable, quote, for Henk and Ingrid to be denied medical care since the beds were occupied by Mohammed and Fatima. And I'm not making this up. Of course, government reacted saying, that it was unacceptable, to have these sort of racist outbursts. But, the imagining and the fixing in space of the problem, had been going on for months beforehand. I can cite various others, similar examples from the European context, including clusters of infection in Austria, in Germany, in the Netherlands, linked to whether meatpacking plants, agricultural processing plants, where migrant workers were first put into conditions of exposure and subsequently blamed for spreading the virus. And here it's really interesting how the kind of border closures that were put into place limiting mobility across the Schengen space were selectively lifted to allow these, quote, essential workers, including the asparagus and strawberry pickers in the south of Holland, to cross borders that were supposedly shut entirely for national protection. There is another aspect to this selective bordering, and it is that linked very much to the kind of selective visibilization that is at play here as well. Because while the virus may appear to be very democratic in its spread, it has been, needless to say, the most vulnerable, but also the most invisible, the most uncounted populations, whether undocumented migrants or the elderly confined to care homes, that have been its first victims. So indeed, being counted today becomes even more directly a condition of protection, a condition of care, of life and death. And here, again, I think we can see some very close parallels with what has been happening in border management. But what does this entail? And I guess this is also a question that I want to throw out to us. I have a wonderful group of colleagues in Amsterdam working on questions of data justice. And what they have been doing over the past months is examining the different responses of EU states in helping to provide care for those who require it, including invisible populations such as irregular migrant populations, or especially people in transit. But while a country like Portugal, that we can look at as an example, took the step quite early on in extending both access to healthcare, but also basic services like housing to all third country nationals on its territory, irrespective of status, other states did quite the opposite, simply hardening or not entirely closing down legal migration and asylum pathways with the excuse of the pandemic, and indeed resorting to further sets of closures, including the militarization of enclosure. So with the excuse of quarantine policies, simply shutting down populations in what were conditions in which it was impossible to stop the spread. So really creating the conditions for super spreader locations. And in this sort of context, kind of choosing not to become visible, choosing not to be counted, not to appear to the authorities or to testing centers, even if it meant ensuring your bodily care, ensuring your very survival, becomes, of course, a calculated risk. And I guess the last thing that I'd like to say to add to the discussion and to come back to how geographical imaginations of the pandemic were profoundly marked by this. This fantasy of protection offered by national borders has very much been offered only to select populations. And what we have seen indeed is rather a profoundly unequal geography of the denial of protection, of the denial of care, where sacrificability and scapegoating have gone very much hand in hand. So I will leave it at that, and I will look forward to hearing the comments of my colleagues.
Thank you, Luisa. May I now request Alessandro to offer his comments?
Can you hear me? Is it
Yes.
fine? So once
Fine.
again, good morning or good afternoon for you, Rana Beer. It's a pleasure to be with you and other colleagues. A special greeting to Luisa, who I have not seen for some time, but it's a pleasure to sit with you. And I'm a little bit humbled by the presence of Alex Saleinikov, because as a non-lawyer, I will say many, many silly things on refugee law. So first of all, I want to beg his understanding and apologize for all the things I would like to share with you, which are probably quite coherent, I think, and converging with what Luisa just said. But I will not talk so much about Afghans today, but still about the refugee regime from my anthropological perspective, and more generally about migration and the way migration is conceived as a category. So as you know, refugee law is partly based on a distinction between forced migration and voluntary migration. And refugees are defined as people who are in need of protection and have lost the protection of their country of origin. So in a sense, I believe this system is inherently state-centric, inevitably state-centric, and I don't see how it can be different. But as an anthropologist, I can have the luxury of trying to decenter my perspective. First of all, for instance, commenting the three solutions to the refugee regime, namely repatriation in the country of origin, integration in the country of first asylum, and resettlement in the third country. So I would say the ontology of sedentariness is very clear in these three solutions, because solutions are found when people stop moving. Mobility as such is seen as a problem. Either you go home where you came from before the problem and you start again your old life, or you settled in the first place where you find refuge. Let's say for Afghans, it could be Pakistan, and you become part of this new society, or you go to a third place, it could be Canada, could be Switzerland, and you start again another life. But you are supposed to stop moving and to stop being mobile from place to place. So solutions are found when people stop moving. Mobility as such is considered to be traumatic for the people and problematic for the states. Obviously, I never wrote about that, but I'm always struck by the opposed figure to the refugee, which is probably the tourist. So mobility is acceptable only when it's for leisure. So here you can be mobile, but it's by your choice. And if you consider, even in the media, the Western media at least, imagine when refugees are dying in their displacement, dying at sea in the Mediterranean, for instance, or crossing borders in Europe. And we know that thousands of refugees are actually and currently dying at the border of Europe. And compare the outrage, public outrage, when a few tourists are killed, like a few years ago, Swiss tourists were killed in Egypt, and the reaction it provoked. So we can see how the mobility of refugees and the mobility of tourists are conceived or perceived as opposed, one being problematic and has to be solved by an absence of mobility, and the tourist mobility, which should be promoted and protected somehow. So in this refugee regime, mobility is seen as a problem, and solutions are found when people stop moving. So I think it's important to, on the one side, to protect this protection regime, because if we weaken it, we will have even less protection for refugees. But I think it's also a luxury to somehow try to decenter our perspective and to think outside this usual dichotomy, and critically addressing the dominant administrative categories. So which kind of comprehensive approach can we propose to migration and mobility? And here I would like to indeed quote Rana Bir, Samadar, but also Thomas Feist in his recent book. So we have probably to look at the colonial legacies, global dispossessions, but also to look at a kind of global class struggle within and between nation states. So to correlate migration with global power relations. Replacing mobilities within the mainstream, without, let's say, without or outside this mainstream framework of forced and voluntary migration, to unify our perspective in what I would call a global landscape of inequalities. Let me play with the categories, proposed a few years ago, more than a few years ago, by Arjuna Padurai. So we are in front of a kind of global inequal space. And that's where I would like to situate my perspective on migrants and the COVID. Very often, I would say mobility is seen as problematic by the states. It can be also conversely understood or presented or read as a subversive action by migrants. So mobility is subversing the normal category of territoriality, and exit here, to refer to Alfred Hirschman, become a form of protest. When people don't have voice, they exit. So I think we have to take seriously the fact that migration is a political act, even when it's not explicitly conceived by the migrant himself or herself as such. By its structural impact, I think migration has to be understood as a political act. And symmetrically to the mobility as a problem, as a form of subversion. A subversion or an act of protest against the unequal repartition of wealth, security, health access, etc., etc. Maybe you have in mind the elephant chart proposed by Lackner and Milanovic on the income distribution in situation of globalization. So it's like an elephant, and we can see that the winners of globalization in the last 20, 25 years are the super rich everywhere and the middle class in the BRICS. The losers are the poor everywhere, and relatively the middle class in the West. So somehow people who are confronted by all these discourses now in Europe on, xenophobia, the non-acceptance of refugees. So in a sense, we can see that people who have relatively lost in the economic globalization are brought together against each other. And somehow Trump voters and the migrants are losers, and they are actually, somehow criticizing each other, or at least the Trump voters. So that's a kind of, I would say, I'm not a Marxist, at least I'm not enough trained in Marxism to arrive at, but I think we have to reinvent or reimport some perspective on class struggle in this picture. And in a new way, because once again, it's the situation is very different from what we could have before. So now my question, the main question which was asked by Ranveer, is what the pandemic, what COVID-19 is telling us about this world, about this global inequal space. So an easy first answer would be to say that it has to be understood in continuity and is exacerbating pre-existing inequalities at national and global levels. So I don't think it's a rupture, it's an exacerbation of something which was present before. But in a sense, it reveals also the pregnance of the nation state as the entity organizing today's world system, as I think Luisa has shown. We could see, for instance, now I have a research on the border between former Yugoslavia and Italy. And in spring, the first reaction of Slovenia was to close the border to prevent, it has been said by Luisa, contagion from Italy, which was the hub, the main center of the infection. Recently, now in fall, again, Slovenia has closed its border for another reason, because Slovenia now is facing a very serious situation and has also not only closed the border outside, but also internal borders, preventing people to move from one region to the other. But we can see very clearly from that mobility, not only between states, but also within states, is seen as a problem. So we have these national re-territorializations, which are somehow must be understood in continuity. So let me refer here to the work of Jean-François Bayard, my colleague in Geneva, who is saying that globalization is actually the combination of three processes. Indeed, it's the generalization of the nation state. The nation state was not generalized over the whole earth before the 50s, to put it like that, before we had heterogeneous territorialities in their political organization with empires and different things. So the nation state was not present everywhere. Then you have obviously selective circulations. Not everybody can circulate commodities, goods, funds, money. And third, we have at the same time, concomitant with the generalization of the nation states, we have localized identities, very violent particularisms, as we see now. So for Jean-François Bayard, these three phenomena have to be understood together. They are not antithetic. They form what he calls globalization. So here, and as I think Ranabir, a text where you discuss your last book that I read recently, you say we have to somehow think together the migrant and the virus. Both are seen as vector of pollution, as a vector of contagion, a threat. So mobility becomes even more suspect now than in the past. With the COVID-19, mobility and all the measure of protections are actually, first of all, meant to prevent mobility. So we have new forms of securitization, surveillance, control at borders, as we have seen between Italy and Slovenia, but also within nations, even between regions like Friuli and Veneto, Lombardy and Tuscany. So prohibition to travel from region to region with quite repressive measures accompanied by moralizing discourses. If you don't comply, you're not a good citizen, you're not a good member of the community. So that's the kind of processes we are attending now. So, and we have this continuity in discourses on crisis. Crisis becomes increasingly the normal and dominant mode of government. That's something which has been described, for instance, by Hassan Haj and obviously by Giorgio Agamben. So today, sometimes it's difficult to quote him yet again and again, but I think he has been quite courageous lately in his public speak on the pandemic. And he's showing once again, and that's in continuity with what he's doing for years, how the state of exception becomes normalized. And that's the normal way. So before COVID, you had obviously the environmental crisis and climate change, war on terror, the terrorist threat. You had the migration crisis, remember 2015 in Europe. So a series of crises which are leading authorities to suspend freedom and fundamental liberties in democratic states even. So we can see, I was struck in Italy to see how deep and profound were promoted these surveillance measures and mechanisms, and that was accepted in the name of health security. So I'm reaching my conclusion. So in a sense, I see what is happening with COVID-19 in continuity with what was happening before, but it's exacerbating, bringing even further some previous logic where mobility is seen as a problem by some institutional actors, but it can also conversely be seen as a form of subversion of some forms of control and territorialization. Thank you.
Alex, may I now request you to offer your views?
Sure, delighted to do so. Very glad to be here and to come third after these comments of Luisa and Alessandro. And I think in many ways mine are complementary. I may move in a slightly different direction, but I think these are all of a piece. Let me suggest that they're, in thinking about the questions you asked us, Ranabir, for this session on the geographical imagination of belonging and the impact on sovereignty of the current pandemic situation. I think there are three ways to go, and I'll briefly describe these three different ways of attacking the problem. The first is that the world might see that collective action is necessary. To use your phrase, might develop a spirit of multilateralism, like for climate or nuclear nonproliferation or movements for human rights. There might be a global ethic of care that is developed. We might see this in the strengthening of the WHO. The United States will rejoin in a Biden administration. We might see a widespread and equitable distribution of a vaccine and shared around the world. That might be the best of all outcomes, but it's not impossible after other emergencies and crises, global crises. We've seen the move in this direction after World War II, the creation of the United Nations and the writing of the Declaration of Human Rights and the like. That would be the optimistic view. A second view is one of increased securitization and greater border control, which both Alessandro and Luisa have talked about. And border control now understood in not just as the physical border between two states, but border control that can be externalized and pushed into other states as well. And from a securitization analysis, you see this in the labeling by Donald Trump of the so-called China virus. This is something that came from afar and is endangering the nation state. And we may have this category in terms of refugee law or refugee thinking of what I might call the pandemically displaced. If we continue to have global pandemics, people may well be on the move to escape the pandemic or escape lockdown orders or escape xenophobia that becomes a part of the response of nation states to the pandemic. I find it really interesting in the current moment that really talk of human rights has been largely muted in terms of the response of states. States are seen as obviously able to protect their citizens from the movement of this dangerous virus, which only comes in the movement of people. And I see this to use a couple of United States examples here, in the US reaction to the so-called Muslim ban, when President Trump came into office and immediately imposed these bans on movement of people from Muslim majority states in the name of security. There was a huge outcry, Supreme Court case brought, people getting to airports and protesting. But there've been a number of COVID bans, which have actually had a much more dramatic impact on immigration into the United States and changed procedures at the border. And there's been virtually no human rights, civil rights outcry. There've been a few lawsuits brought by the ACLU and maybe even some victories there, but it has not been the same kind of outcry. Also inside the United States, there has been this movement of citizens against the lockdown, as there has been in many states, a so-called COVID fatigue of people stuck at home and no longer willing to not be able to work and not see their friends and their family. And so you've had the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, saying that these lockdowns are the greatest limitations on freedom inside the United States since slavery, a really extraordinary statement, but of course not applied to non-citizens. There's no sense that there's an unfair burdening of citizens who want to move to the United States to join family or to work or to come for other reasons. And in fact, the COVID crisis has been used by the Trump administration to accomplish other goals that it has sought in terms of limiting limiting immigration to the U.S. in the name of securitization, and protection from the so-called China virus. The third possible approach is a differentiated approach. And here I like the way Louisa described this as differential sorting and selective bordering. And you might have this nation to nation, like trade, most favored nations, or free movement agreements for groups of states if it's decided that these states are largely virus free, or some kind of immunity passport can be developed that would help people move, like bilateral migration arrangements or mutual defense pacts. And we see this again with the US in terms of the agreements reached with Mexico and Canada, where essential workers, as Alessandro mentioned, are able to come across the border because they're needed in industry in the US, particularly for agricultural interests in the United States, and students as well are able to travel. But asylum seekers, there's a dramatic new procedure, not really even a procedure. Asylum seekers are simply pushed back at the US border. Really the most dramatic kind of actions taken against asylum seekers now. And there's barely a whisper in the United States about this. There's no great movement to protect asylum because of these differentiated views of who is coming. I think it's this third approach that's most likely, that states will work with other states. On some movement, they'll put up barriers to other states. So there'll be some facilities, there'll be a way to find facilitating measures for states whose citizens other states would like to permit to enter, through kind of soft measures of control, like a requirement of a vaccination or quarantine at entry for some period of time. But there'll be bars for other states and other groups trying to come to the country. If this is true, then I don't see a dramatic change in the notion of sovereignty, perhaps even a strengthening of a notion of sovereignty, and a continuing, as Alessandro said, of the global inequalities. I think he said even an exacerbation of the global inequalities that come from these kinds of hard notions of sovereignty. So in short, I guess I'm arguing that the pandemic control will be normalized within the regime of nation states. in some ways like the response to 9/11 in the United States, where travel was closed down, all airplanes stopped, all movement stopped for a while, but there was eventual return to travel and increased movement across the border, much more now than, well, except for COVID. Until COVID, there had been much more movement, and a continuing increase in movement across borders, despite concerns about security. But what did we do, and other countries do as well, is to impose new kinds of screening at borders and other kinds of safeguards. So if this is true, if this is what we're likely to see with the pandemic, which is some kind of requirements for people to show they're not infected coming from favored states, then I think we're not likely to see, as Ranabir, his ideal world at the end of his introductory essay to his book on this. We won't see a biopolitics from below, to use his phrase. We're not going to see a new national or global ethic of care arising out of the pandemic. And I would say, why should we expect that? The global response to the pandemic, why would that be any different than the global response to global hunger or poverty or other endemic diseases? These have not led to a global ethic of care around the world. And I think, to go back to my first example, we're going to see this in the inequitable distribution of vaccines when they're developed. Final comment here on another part of Ranabir's introductory questions here about what the political economy of migration might look like. Here, I think the one new thing we will see, or the continuation of what the pandemic will add significant influence on, is the increasing role of technology and surveillance. So some nation states are already requiring immigrants to download tracking apps on their cell phones when they arrive, so that their location can be tracked and tracing could occur if they develop the disease. I can easily imagine that immigrants are given bracelets to wear that will monitor their health. Already we have these developing for people active in exercise that can monitor heartbeat and temperature and blood pressure and oxidation levels and the like. And I could easily see, as part of the attempt to control the new diseases coming in, that this would simply be something that immigrants agree to. And of course, once deployed on immigrants, it's going to be hard not to then deploy such measures on citizens as well. So if there is a major impact of the pandemic, I think it's not going to be so much in terms of new notions of sovereignty, but rather it will be in this increasing surveillance that will make even the border less important, because you'll have surveillance by individuals, surveillance as border, as people move around these states. Is this the normalization of a state of exception? I think not. I don't see it in those terms. I think as I said, I think the crisis will dissipate and be normalized within existing ways that states control population flows, with this extra push on technology. Now, to get to one other issue that I know Ranabir has argued in the form of analysis that's important to Ranabir, is what's the issue of race here. We've already heard in Louise's presentation how xenophobic reactions have become endemic around in many countries in the world due to the pandemic. One might think that this increased monitoring, the scientific role of watching people, would actually make that less significant, because everybody would be treated equally, everybody would be seen as a potential vector of the disease. I just think that's unlikely, given the kinds of profiling that will be undertaken, algorithms that are built according to existing logics likely to code for race, because race is so much a part of the way that these nations view the world. I think this will be built in, and this technology will not be an end to race consciousness, but will be other ways to play that out. I guess my concluding remark here would be that, I don't think there are any iron rules of history that certain kinds of disruptions lead to either good or bad things, either global democracy or a nation states ruled by despots. And that means ultimately that these are political questions. And if they're political questions, it means that the answers lie in the hands of human beings as they do political work around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, these three presentations, I'm quite sure that these presentations will evoke questions and new thinking. And something that Alex ended with, that there are no iron rules of history. And I just thought, before I begin with the questions that have been sent, that I mean, to the question, I mean, in the sense, it's not crystal ball gazing, but what may be the likely trend? And you asked that if there was no great change when people were experiencing global hunger, why should we expect that there will be a different kind of response? And I mean, two of the things which two responses that would probably be posed to Luisa and Alessandro, but certainly to you, Alex, would be that when I was writing that, I was reminded of, for example, Thucydides, this whole description of the Peloponnesian War and how Athens repeatedly lost due to plague, and the plague happened because of the weak moral character, weak organization of the city, and therefore the city had to pay the price again and again. So it may be that because of this certain concatenation of circumstances where you have the global economic crisis, the financial crisis continuing, you have the crisis of liberal democracy in the sense that right-wing populism will be emerging everywhere. And then you have what you may call, we were thinking of environmental crisis, but it came in the form of a life crisis. So my whole question was, probably I'm too much located in my local experiences, that I was thinking, is this not again the time of a meeting point of several crises, that we have this great crisis which we are calling by epidemiological name? And it may not be that the number of deaths will be as staggering as it had been in earlier cases, but on the other hand, its impact could be much more telling. So that was one of the reasons. And I was also thinking, I mean, sharing with you a bit of history of our part of the world, that in the colonial time, probably the plague extracted a larger number of lives. We don't know. Or the influenza epidemic. But on the other hand, malaria, which year after year destroyed people's lives, but much more in villages rather than in the cities. But it is the disease in the city that hogged the attention. For understandable reason, the reason was to clean up the city, to make it safe for trade, commerce, etc. But when the post-colonial government came, it was eradication of malaria that then finally got whatever importance it got, and deservedly the malaria control and malaria eradication program that then, finally earned the due notice that it had to. So we don't know really in that sense that how exactly the politics of care and broadly what you might call the politics of life would evolve. But perhaps, I mean, the reason for pushing all of you to that point was that, is this the kind of moment that forces politics around the question of life? I mean, in one sense, we can say all questions are around life, but then not all questions are directly articulated, around that. So that was, one thing, but I hope we can come back to this. There is one question which is to the panel again, and then we shall give the floor to you. With the rise of right-wing politics all over the world, it is Imon Mitro, we can see the question of political sovereignty is back in a strong way, and the migrant is being looked at as a threat as much as the virus is a threat to the sovereignty of the body. What could be a strategy of the left radical quarters to counter this association between the virus and the migrants, especially when the metaphorical association engenders material repercussion? Any one of the panelists would like to respond to this question? Alex, Luisa, Alexandro?
Well, I can say a couple of things
Alex,
here.
yeah, please.
So, let's think about this threat. Look, when there's a vaccine, already in the United States, there's this view that the crisis is over. In the middle of the worst moment, where more people are dying now, more people are infected, the basic view here is it's over because these vaccines are 95% effective, 2 of them that have been created, and in 6 months or a year, we'll all be back to normal. And I think the view would be that around the world in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this pandemic will be gone. Now there'll be another pandemic after that, but then we'll find these new vaccines are based on a new RNA technology. We'll learn how to do that. And so these viruses will not be seen as a threat. I think, again, this will be normalized in the same way that, in 100 years or so, as the population of the world begins to decline, if development keeps up at some kind of level, migrants won't be seen as a threat. I mean, these are all part of broader historical trends. So I'm not saying not to worry about this. There isn't great harm being done now. But so I think at least on the virus side, I think what the political strategy from the left, I think, has to be focused on equitable distribution of this vaccine, if we have any hope of making any progress on global inequality. And that's going to be a huge fight because, as the question notes, this much stronger sense of political sovereignty. So you can just be sure in the United States, if the vaccine is here, it's going to be for Americans first, and then it will go elsewhere. But I think that's going to be the most important immediate political action that needs to be fought. But I'd be interested to hear what Luisa and Alessandro say about that as well.
I can jump in, Ranabir, if that's okay, to follow on that, because I think, and I see there is another question that's also related, kind of thinking about how this will impact populist politics. I guess I would go back, Alex, to what you were saying in your comments, and tracing the continuity between responses to the terrorist threat and to the virus threat, because just as during the war on terror, we had a progressive territorialization of the security state, even though the threat was non-territorial. What we're seeing increasingly, and we will see increasingly, and I agree with Alex that this will go beyond the pandemic, is this, increasing not just territorialization, but individualization of security and surveillance, whether through datafication and, kind of other forms of counting that will remain with us. And yes, first, I think implemented, and it's already unfortunately happening on the most vulnerable and the most uncounted populations, so migrant populations, and then very likely rolled out to the rest of the citizenry. But I think there's also something else happening, and this goes back, I think, to the question of sovereignty, because I was thinking also to follow up on what you were saying, Alex, about the anti-lockdown protests, the anti-masking protests in various contexts. Because what is happening there is another, I think, shift and another kind of unpacking of rights, because the claims to individual sovereignty, to personal sovereignty that these movements are launching, which are absurdities in the legal conception, right? This further kind of unpacks sovereign rights and who can lay claim to them. I mean, these are people who are laying claim to, to the ability to move despite lockdowns, and saying it is my individual choice, my individual responsibility. I don't care about the rest of you. And of course, this is, certain individuals that are lodging those claims. And I think, kind of thinking then back to what will happen to far-right movements, to populist movements, these new kind of forms of claims making combined with the convergence of several crises. Certainly in the European context, it is not just the pandemic, but the pandemic overlaying existing political economic inequalities still coming along from the previous financial crisis. I mean, the inequalities across Europe, of course, if we compare them to global inequalities, they are, minuscule, but still, those have just been exacerbated by the pandemic, overlaid by ecological crises, and we begin to have a very explosive mixture. So even though I think in this moment, many populist movements and parties have lost support, because I think there's been this rallying around parties in government and more centrist parties that somehow are seen as offering protection, they're not going away. And indeed, I think they will find other other discourses and other modes of entering the political space. So I think actually, and I appreciate very much the question of, what is the strategy to counter this? We need to think of those strategies fast. And one thing is certainly assuring equal access, or as equal as can be, to healthcare, to vaccines, and whatever else is needed. So I'll leave it at that.
Alessandro, would you have a response to the question?
Yeah, with pleasure. So maybe I would like to answer from a slightly different perspective. First, that's true. We rightly point at xenophobia, populism, and probably now, as Luisa just said, it's not their let's say, most important time, but it will come back. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that we should also count, if we should count something, initiatives of solidarity, which are quite impressively widespread. And I think always insisting on xenophobia, and we have to be extremely vigilant, but we should equally, I think, try to valorize and to show how many initiatives are going on an opposite direction. And if you look at the French Revolution, probably the political figure at that time was the citizen. It was around the figure of the citizen that new philosophical options were thought, that the social contract was conceived. Probably today, I think the political figure of today could be the migrant. So probably we should think about a new social contract, looking at what the migrant is doing to our imaginary and our everyday life. I see migrants because I spend part of my time with migrants, and mobile people because I like to open up the box of the categories. I feel also an incredible inventivity, creativity, even if you look at artists, how many young Afghans who are in Berlin, but also already arriving in places like Athens, are incredibly productive, and they are true artists. They may write poetry, novels, they take photographs, they express themselves in different ways, which have to be, I think, understood, listened to, and take extremely seriously as a kind of, once again, alternative discourse on who we are and what is the new social contract we have to develop. Sorry, I'm just taking an example. I was in Vienna recently at the Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen. Before the lockdown, I was lucky enough to go to an exhibition on Banksy, an artist I found extremely interesting. This street artist who is anonymous, and we don't know who is he. And I was super excited to see his work, but taken outside the street, within something which was like a museum, it was obviously totally denaturated. I was extremely saddened, almost depressed, to see how this piece of art, his production, which is inherently should be subversive, was recuperated, if you want, by the normal system, economic system of art and art consumption. So I thought that's probably not here, not Banksy himself, but the way he was displayed, I didn't see a lot of stamina here and energy to think differently outside the boxes, what art should be. And I see that in places like Berlin in particular, for what I know, young artists, refugees, have to be listened to, and it can offer an avenue to rethink our social contract. So I don't know if you are familiar with this initiative, but young Afghans have launched, on the model of what is going on in the States, this movement, Afghan Lives Matter, which is articulated not only on political mobilization with non-Afghans, obviously, but also with all a new image production. So it's about representing artists, representing refugees in a different way. And that's how we can reenact new forms of social relations. So I think we have, I may be a little bit naive in saying so, I think we should give a place to art production in our way of defending some values and refunding some forms of social contracts.
There is one question which is addressed to Alex. The question is that it is from Shamata Bishas. Is the difference in response from the US public regarding Trump's travel ban and the increasing monitoring of immigration as a result of COVID-19 connected to the imagination of COVID-19 as inherently infectious and connected to migration? And because, and this is partly reflects on what Alexandru had said, because at the same time we saw the spectacular mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement. So you have in the US, on one hand, this whole question of travel ban, monitoring of immigration, etc. And on the other hand, as Shamata says, the spectacular mobilization of Black Lives Matter, and now here of Afghan Lives Matter. So Alex, do you have any response to that?
I don't. I'd want to think about, so would the response to the pandemic in the US today, let's do a counterfactual, be different if there had not been a Black Lives Matter movement that came alive this summer? You know, I see it almost in the reverse, that it was the lockdowns that led to the mass, at least, you know, white participation in the Black Lives Matter, because people were so tired of being locked up. They wanted a reason to be out and to join with others, and they'd felt this loss of solidarity with other people. I don't know, that's a weak argument and not very interesting, but I mean, if there's any relation, that's the immediate relationship I see between these two movements. But it's interesting to think about how it would go the other way. In other words, just as Alessandro said, that if we're talking about life itself, Ranabir, as you have said, and whether it's a policeman putting a knee on your neck or a virus that's killing you, do those somehow go together? I haven't thought enough about that to have something smart to say.
Okay, there is one more question to the panel, so anyone can. What implications this crisis can have for populist politics? I think we had some discussion, but do we see the approach towards migrants changing in any substantive way? We had I think, some discussion on that, but any further reflection on populist politics? Manish Jha addresses, he hasn't said specifically whether it will be left-wing populism or right-wing populism. But Louisa, you want to come on this?
Sure. And yeah, maybe I can.
And do the populists have any kind of different imagination? Because you were speaking of the cartographic imagination, differential kind of.
The populists don't. I think that's what makes them populists. But, you know, maybe this way I can connect back to what Alessandro was saying, because I think, you know, the challenge is telling different stories. It really is telling different stories that are not necessarily tied to national state imaginaries that are necessarily exclusivist, necessarily have a territorial conception of rights. And perhaps, I mean, I think, you know, that is what is wonderful about the artistic imaginary, is the possibility to hopefully go beyond that. And I think in this moment, it's not only telling different stories about mobility, about, you know, I mean, I'm thinking back, Alessandro, to what you were saying in your presentation about, you know, kind of this ontology of sedentarism, you know, if, and so, telling different stories about mobility, about what it means. But I think also, and here, you know, kind of to go back to far right and populist movements, making new public spaces, whether it's through art or, you know, kind of thinking of creating also physical spaces, which becomes increasingly difficult. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is it has closed down forcibly spaces of debate, spaces of contact. I mean, you know, since the solutions, medical and political, have been of enclosure, of closure, this is very problematic. I mean, and it has, you know, profound impacts for politics. So I think, you know, kind of going back to the previous question of what the various protest movements that have emerged, you know, how they have attempted to reclaim public space in a pandemic, I think that's very important. But I think in this sense also, artistic interventions have attempted to do that as well. And if there's one place where I would hope we can work, both in kind of telling different stories about mobility, telling different stories about migration, and making literally space for different kinds of politics, I think that's a very important, I think, direction. I'll leave it.
Okay. Alex, would you like to
Well, I have two thoughts.
Any response?
Yeah, two thoughts on this. In some ways, I keep coming back to this idea of this, we'll have the normalization of the response. So, you know, the United States and other countries have kept people with diseases out of their borders for a long time. I mean, some of the earliest, very earliest immigration restrictions were to keep people who were sick from coming in. You know, famous Ellis Island, there's this big, huge stairway that immigrants had to walk up. And at the top of the stairway was an immigration officer in the 1910s and 20s who would use chalk to write on the back of people if they were walking in a funny way or it looked like they might have tuberculosis or whatever. And there was a giant hospital built on Ellis Island to take care of sick people and not let them in the country. So the idea that countries keep out sick people is not new. So this is just a new expression of it, a new manifestation of it. So in that way, it's not a new development. And the same way, the populist response, the xenophobic response, is simply another manifestation of xenophobia against another kind of threat, whether it's the Muslim threat and terrorism or the pandemic threat and virus. So I'm not sure it dramatically changes populism. And again, if a vaccine takes care of this issue and people can show that been vaccinated to come in, this may drift away. On the other hand, I mean, so I want to make the claim, and I want to go back to the earlier question about radical politics here. You know, in the US, the objection to the lockdowns has come from the populists. I could imagine a left-wing movement against these lockdowns for the kind of reasons Louisa just described of it has closed down open spaces and protests. Now, it didn't stop the Black Lives Matter movement, although the right wing in the US said, oh, this is interesting. The liberals want to keep us home, but suddenly when they've got their issue, they don't mind if they're out there. And the liberals said, yes, but we're all wearing masks and none of you people are wearing masks or whatever. But leaving that aside, there was a desire to be out and to protest. And I could imagine a movement coming from the left that ultimately says these lockdowns are ways to keep political movement, political agitation, left-wing movements at home, and they become convenient ways for states to act. So it'd be interesting to see and let me, final way to think about this, Audrey Macklin has suggested this, a scholar at the University of Toronto. She said, we used to, since the human rights movement, we've seen the right to free movement, which of course hasn't been realized around the world, is nonetheless seen by many people as a human right to move anywhere, and certainly applied to citizens within a country, and maybe not for people crossing borders. But with the pandemic and the lockdowns, as was pointed out, not only did you have restrictions between from one country to another, but restrictions inside the country that were quite dramatic, and these lockdowns, that we discovered that the right to move, it's not a right to move. Really, no one has a right to move, but in many liberal states, there's been permission to move within the country. That was withdrawn as soon as there was a reason to do it. And if it's perceived that way, then again, a radical politics might begin to talk about freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of demonstration, in a way that will look somewhat like the populist politics.
Can I just jump in very quickly on that? Because I think one of the things that has troubled me about that is that unfortunately in many European contexts, there has been this, as you will be aware, this strange alliance of not necessarily kind of radical left politics, but certainly the radical ecological movements and some parts of green movements have allied themselves in these anti-masking demonstrations. But not to claim rights for all, but really in kind of individualizing those claims to rights. So saying, I can take care of my own body. I don't need the state intervening to tell me what to do. But in this sense, it's not extending the space of rights. It's it's extending the space of the virus, if anything. But denying care to others, saying I'm not going to wear a mask. And so I wonder how that could be rearticulated, because I would think that it could be, but certainly it hasn't been so far.
And if I could, I'm sorry to jump in one more time, just to, it's a really interesting thought. So, of course, the movement for reproductive rights in the United States has been all about the right to control one's body, which has been the liberal perspective. And on the climate side, people have pointed out that we've had the lowest CO2 emissions around the world because of the pandemic, which is quite interesting. In the United States, the environmental movement in the 70s gave rise to the zero population growth movement, which gave rise to anti-immigrant positions. So there is this weird alliance of these groups.
There is one last question, and then with some observations, we shall close this discussion. This question is to the panel. There is this argument that there will be no return to the previous normal, and a new normal will be conceived on old ruins. If we keep the refugee question here, I wonder aloud whether much changes for refugees living in camp-like settlements. What is the nature of normalcy then in such a settlement where mobility is restricted in any way? If we consider the question of life together with this, then still now stateless people living as asylum seekers or refugees are argued to be not belonging anywhere politically, living in a state of limbo or in a condition of suspension of life. Therefore, does the pandemic change or impact them at all? So, Alex, Luisa, this is again a very interesting and insightful poser. So short responses to this. Anyone? Alex, maybe, or anyone?
All right, well, I feel like I've spoken too much. I'll be very brief. First, I mean, it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting that the pandemic really has not hit refugee camps. There was great concern that given the way people live in camps, that it would be spread wildly and there'd be huge problems. And in part, this is demographic because people are younger, or maybe because of prior immunities or something, but it hasn't been that dramatic. But the question really went to, what's I guess the way we think about limits on mobility for refugees. Of course, most refugees don't live in camps, right? So in some ways, the camp analogy is not really helpful. But my basic view on this, I guess I'm coming around to saying here, is that there are lots of things changing in the world. There may be a new normal. There may be different ideas of sovereignty, et cetera. I just don't think the pandemic is going to be a central mover of those changes. And Ranabir, you've been very quiet, but I know you think it would be, and I'd love to hear, maybe you have some concluding comments to make your case on why you think we're at a juncture that the pandemic will be the spark to other ways of thinking about states and mobility and the like.
Okay, before we close it, I will respond to Alex, but this will also be, my attempt to push Alexandru a bit farther on his question of social contract. And this is a question to all of you, or not a question, but my own reading. My idea is that, and Alex, I will, seek pardon from you, that human rights question is not really the crucial question here. In other words, human rights against the restrictions of lockdown, human rights, the right to not to wear mask, the right to free space, the space that was lost, etc. These might have been relevant to a time, and Alexandru was referring to the post-French Revolution or the time, when the rights in that sense, the rights of man, the rights of citizens, we all know that became crucial. My point is that whether the new social contract, and this is therefore in a way pushing Alexandru a little farther, and also posing a question to you, Alex, that what is my idea, that whether this new social contract will be around the whole question of care and protection. In other words, the legitimacy of the state will not depend on how much rights it protects of the rights of the people, but how much care it ensures for those who need care. And I'm not saying in a philanthropic sense, but in a sense of what is socially accepted, or whether the state is able to extend protection to those which are in the sense of a moral economy of the society. The society thinks, well, look, these people need immediate protection. While the current fault lines in the whole, our imaginary of protection, our imaginary of care will be there, and new fault lines will appear. But my understanding is that the virus and the present epidemiological crisis will perhaps, and this is where I want to ask Alexandru also, that whether the new social contract will be towards setting up a new type of public power whose legitimacy derives from its power to extend care, power to provide care, and power to provide protection. In some way, we go back. I mean, if you think in terms of political philosophy, rather, perhaps we are again invoking or re-invoking the old Republican question posed by Machiavelli and others. What is the legitimacy of the public power that we argue for as the contract that will set up? And my point was that whether this epidemiological moment and this epidemiological crisis, is there something on the horizon to say that the legitimacy of the present regimes fast depleted because of this? And therefore, it also, in a way, provides impetus for new imaginaries of what can be the nature of the new power. And therefore, I would ask Alexandru also that, can you push your question of new social contract, which I think globally emerging, whether the states will immediately accept it or not, perhaps in our long vision is a secondary question, but whether this is becoming a relevant question, whether in the East or in the West, whether in the South or in the North, whether people are saying, was this power capable of protecting us when we needed its protection? I mean, I'm not only saying that Biden raised this question again and again in his election speech campaigns, but also everywhere people ask, have our states done enough? Could they have done otherwise? So Alexandru, I would love to hear comments, brief, but we will end it in 3, 4, or 5 minutes. So please.
Okay. So you raise a big philosophical question, and now you are cruel enough to tell me that I have half a minute to answer, or trying to even begin to answer.
3 minutes, okay.
So we have talked about the state and legitimacy, political legitimacy. I would like to maybe add another dimension in the discussion, which is labor. I think we have also to, for me, the social contract has to go through refunding of economic production, exchange, and consumption. I'm very surprised if I look at my entourage, people around me, the level of people who are suffering at work, and as if jobs are not providing the space now for humans to realize themselves in their social being and nature. So it's not the place where people are realizing who they are. And we have talked about protest movements, people who are getting engaged, committed to offer a kind of an alternative public space. But I think there is also another form of protest, which Paolo Virno, an Italian philosopher, in one text I have seen online, was defining as engaged withdrawal. So people who are actually deciding to withdraw from the public scene and to reinvent themselves in their social ties at a local level, almost in an autarkic way. And I think that's also extremely interesting. So you have a malaise, what I would call a kind of labor fatigue. So the working place, and maybe I talk because I'm an academic and I can also find or feel some fatigue sometimes, but I think the working context, milieu, jobs are not anymore as important socially than they could have been in the 60s and 70s. And people are actively, very often, trying to find alternative way of being together. And they are trying to reinvent the social contract, not a little bit, not against the authorities, not against questioning the legitimacy of the state, but somehow bypassing it and trying to get also out of the circulation, the circles of circulation of mainstream capitalism. So I think it's a new social contract has to go through a reinvention of economic ties and the way we consume, but before consuming, produce and exchange. We have to reread people like Polanyi. Maybe the market is not the horizon of humankind and human history. So that would be my non-response to your question. So I think there is a malaise, and there is a kind of escape from the question of legitimacy, in a sense.
I had left out one more, and with this we shall end, surely. And this is from Aisha Chalar. In relation to the nation state regaining its strength, aren't we seeing a kind of a restructuring of the nation state very much centered around executive emergency laws? Now, even the basis of liberal democracies, etc. But do we see, therefore, a kind of left politics mobilized against this restructuring of governance and against combining the surveillance and erosion of even the democratic rights of having a voice? We had discussed, but any kind of last, thought for the present moment on, once again, any thought on whether the left politics, can you visualize something against such a kind of restructuring of governance?
I mean, I will maybe say something. I don't know if this is really an answer directly to Aisha's question, but at least, not to just focus on the right and on populist forces. Unfortunately, certainly left and center-left governments have implemented exactly the same sort of measures in terms of containment and restrictions of rights, I mean, at least in the European context. But I think what is really important, and Alessandro was already hinting at that, is that there have been incredible initiatives of solidarity. And I guess rather than talking about the social contract, I'd like to talk about, this reemergence of understandings of what solidarity means at the local level through, various initiatives that go beyond and above whatever the state is doing. Also bringing access to healthcare for migrant populations, but also rethinking what this moral economy can be. And I think, certainly, again, this is, specifically in the EU context, while states have nationalized all sorts of things, including access to vaccines, there is a growing support, actually, for sharing healthcare costs. I mean, certainly this is, again, in the EU context, which goes completely against what, national governments have been pronouncing. So all the recent survey data that has been coming out over the past months, maybe because it is a situation of crisis and fear, people are willing to share resources across borders for the very first time. I mean, despite of what the national governments are saying. So I think, we do need to understand that as well. It hasn't only been about closure and about the need, to rush to protection. And I think that is important to consider. So, on a more optimistic note, I think we do also need to think of that.
Great. With this optimistic note, whether you want it to be the last word or not, so we have to close this session. Thanks to all the panelists. It was great having you, and hopefully one day, not in the too distant future, but hopefully, soon enough, in 1 or 2 years, we shall have you over to Calcutta in the midst of our program. This program takes place each and every year. So from 2003, we have been running the program. Earlier, it was a 15-day orientation course. Now this is a research workshop of 5 days, 6 days, 4 days of conference workshop, followed by a 2-day conference. So hopefully we shall have you. And protecting the protection system, whatever that is there, that is something that we have in mind. This workshop and conference discusses the whole question of protection from as many angles as possible, from as many levels, as many dimensions. We have photographs, we have short research papers, abstracts. So the menu is rich, and with you the menu would be richer. So thanks to all of you, and with this we close this session. Thanks once again.
Allow me a minute.
Okay. Please, Kushumika.
Please give me a minute. I'm on the sound. 1 second. Yeah, Roger.
Go ahead, Kushumika. Go ahead.
I just want to thank. Yeah, me.
You just want to thank everybody. I'll offer thanks on behalf of you.
Now I'm available, and this is fine.
Okay.
Excuse me for that. I'm sitting in the main venue where a lot of echo is present. But allow me to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Institute for Human Sciences Vienna for enabling us to do this. And it would be remiss if I let you go without thanking our esteemed panelists and also our moderator. So thank you very much on behalf of Calcutta Research Group. We hope you'll be joining us for our further session.
কারণ তখন তুমি
Okay.
থামতে যেত অডিওটা অফ হয়ে
Thank